Hi everyone, I hope this finds you well. This is just going to be a quick video where we go over the requirements for the final project in a little bit of detail. So I've got the final project sheet here. It says the due date is Thursday, May 14th at the end of the day, and it says no extensions here at the top. So I've pushed our final project presentation day to the end of CEP week since we're not actually going to be meeting in person to do any presentations. So I've pushed the due date to Thursday. That's the last day of CEP week. That's the last day that I can accept any submissions and still get the grading and stuff done on my end to get things submitted to Banner in time. So I've already pushed the final due date as late as it can be, so I wouldn't be able to offer any extensions on the final project. So the requirements are: create a work of electronic music in VCV Rack and or SoundGrain lasting between 3 and 6 minutes in length. So we're taking the skills that we've really put together the last half of the semester using VCV Rack and SoundGrain, and you're going to choose between those or use a combination of the two of them to create a work of electronic music that lasts between 3 and 6 minutes in length. And there's no really specific requirements like there are with your assignments like assignment 4 and assignment 5. This is going to be a little more open-ended and allows you guys to really pursue what you're interested in. So the project can function as an addition to the student's portfolio and should be created with that in mind. So by that I mean this doesn't need to just be thought of as a final project for this class, as a requirement to get a passing grade in DMP 352. But think of this as something you can add to your portfolio, that is your body of work that you might show to a future prospective employer or a prospective collaborator as a demonstration. These are the things I'm capable of. This is the kind of thing I've worked on. So think of it that way. Think of it something to demonstrate what you're capable of and not just as a final grade for this class. So it says you guys will have a choice for the following options for your projects, and then I've listed 3 options. So again, these are options and not individual requirements. So I just need one of these. The first one, a project completed in VCV Rack. So create a project in VCV Rack that is capable of producing 3 to 6 minutes of music. The patch should have some generative and or performative capabilities. That is, it should generate music that is constantly changing and or allows the user to directly engage with it in a performative manner to change the material. So basically this is just a way of saying that you're making a patch in VCV Rack, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be static, that you build the patch and then the piece just runs for 3 minutes. Instead, it should have some generative or performative capabilities. That is, as it runs over the course of the 3 minutes, either on its own, that's what generative means, it's going to constantly change and develop and produce different music over the course of that time. Or through performative means, that is, you're going to engage with it by changing knobs, changing parameters, starting and stopping sequences, and things like that. You're going to make the music continuously change or be different over the course of those 3 to 6 minutes. So you can do this by starting and stopping different sequencers, routing signals through matrices and switches, and just adjusting different parameters like opening and closing a filter, changing the octave of a VCO, things like that. So I'm going to post a separate video that will function as our final lesson this semester, which will go over these 2 things in more detail and give you guys some possible suggestions for different tools and different ways to approach this. So if you do this first option, it says such a project would be recorded and submitted as a VCV file and an audio recording. So just like your past assignments. Your second option is to complete a project in SoundGrain and a DAW. So create a project using Audacity, Reaper, GarageBand, or some other DAW, which arranges sound files that have been generated in SoundGrain. So basically what you're doing, we talked about SoundGrain last week. So you can go into SoundGrain, take an audio file of any source, and work with it in SoundGrain, generate some different sound files by using the recording option, and then maybe you're changing some different parameters, changing the density, the pitch, etc. And then you save and export those files from SoundGrain. And it's probably unlikely you'll get a really strong piece if you just did that once. If you just took one sound file from SoundGrain and said, this is my piece, that probably wouldn't cut it. But you might make a few of those, either with the same sound file or maybe with some different ones. And then you can arrange those files in Audacity or Reaper or GarageBand and create an actual piece of music. So the project could consist of layers of granulated sound which originate from the same source, or many different sources. While not all the sounds need to be granulated in SoundGrain, it's expected that the majority, about 70%, will. So you might make a piece where you're using a lot of these granulated sounds from SoundGrain, and maybe you want to include some other sounds to give the piece a little bit more diversity. That's fine. It makes a lot of sense. Maybe you want to include, say you're granulating a bunch of trombone sounds, and maybe you want to include some ungranulated trombone sounds to kind of help tie things together. Or maybe you're granulating a bunch of hip-hop samples, and then you want to use a hip-hop acapella on top that's not granulated, or something like that. That's fine. That's good. That makes a lot of sense. But since this would be effectively a granulation project, I would expect that most of the sounds that you use come from SoundGrain. So such a project would be recorded and then submitted as an audio recording and a DAW session. So you would upload your WAV file or your MP3, and then you would also upload your Audacity file, your Reaper file, your GarageBand file, whatever DAW you're using, you would upload the session as well. Your third option then is to do some combination of the top two. So a project that contains elements that are completed in VCV Rack or SoundGrain. So create a project using Audacity, Reaper, GarageBand, or some other DAW which arranges sound files that have been generated in both SoundGrain and VCV Rack. So maybe you've got some granulated trombone samples, and then you mix that with a couple sequences that you've recorded in VCV Rack. Or maybe you make a sequence or a drum beat in VCV Rack, and then you granulate it in SoundGrain, and then when you're mixing together the original and then the granulated version. So again, while not all the sounds need to originate in SoundGrain or VCV Rack, it's expected that the majority will. And here I even said a little bit more, since you've got two different sound sources to work with, VCV Rack and SoundGrain. Definitely the vast majority of the sounds should come from those two sources, but if you want to include other things as well, that's fine. So such a project would be recorded and submitted as an audio recording, a VCV file, and a DAW session. So this one doesn't necessarily require more work, but it does require more things to submit. The audio recording, the VCV file, and the DAW session. So in lieu of a final presentation, usually we meet during CEP week and you guys present your projects to one another. And then I see not only what you did, but I also get to hear you explain it and talk about the things you were trying to do in your piece. So we won't be able to do that this semester. So in lieu of that, you guys will write an extended program note. A program note is kind of like a little description of a piece that a composer writes and usually includes in the program at a classical music concert or something like that. So I'm going to ask you guys to write one of those, except a little bit longer than most program notes. Most program notes are maybe a paragraph. I'm going to ask you guys to write a page, but it's a page double space, which honestly is not usually much longer than a paragraph. So you're going to write an extended program note describing your work, the techniques that you employed, the aesthetic goals of the project. That is, what were you trying to do in your piece? What were you trying to get across? What was interesting to you, and what were you trying to dive into? So the program note should address at least 3 techniques covered over the course of the class that are utilized in the piece. So you're going to talk about 3 things you did in your project that we talked about. So for instance, I've listed here sequencing, FM synthesis, and granulation density. So those are 3 that we've talked about really just in the past few weeks, but you might also do something that we talked about earlier in the semester, like sample and hold, or cutoff frequency modulation, or envelope shaping, things like that. Honestly, especially if you're working in VCV Rack, it's going to be really difficult for you to do this and not accidentally use 3 techniques. So this is more about just pointing those things out, naming them, and addressing them. If you're working in SoundGrain, it might seem a little bit more difficult, but you can talk about the different granulation parameters that you're using. For instance, granulation density, granulation pitch change, different lengths of different granulations, the different trajectories that you can draw in SoundGrain. So each of those could count as different techniques. It's all in the way that you work with them and then lay them out and explain them. So I will be available via email or through the discussion board on Blackboard for coaching and advising on this project in any ways that are needed. So you guys have about 2 weeks to work on this project. Judging by some of the assignment 5s that were submitted, it seems like there's a few of you guys who might not have a super firm grasp on some of the patching techniques in VCV Rack. Or maybe you're still new to working with SoundGrain or something like that. So if you have questions about any aspect of this project as you're working, whether it's I'm trying to build a kick drum in VCV Rack, but it's not sounding right, or I'm trying to arrange these sounds in Audacity and I can't quite get the sound to move where I want it to, or anything like that. Or, hey, I'm working with Reaper for the first time, which is something we actually didn't talk about in this class at all. I've not actually worked with a DAW like this before. How do I do X, Y, or Z? Or even aesthetic questions like, hey, I think this piece needs to have some kind of sudden change here. I'm not sure which direction to go. Any of these kinds of questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm here to help you guys out on this project. I'm not doing anything in particular in the next couple of weeks except answering student emails and things like that. So by all means, take advantage of this. Reach out to me, ask me how to help you with these projects. Even if you want to submit something a little early and say, hey, have I covered all the bases? Is this what you're looking for? Does this patch look right? Things like that. That's what I'm here for. So please reach out to me and have me help you out on this. So here's your final checklist. Assignments will receive full credit if they contain 3 to 6 minutes of music, use at least 3 synthesis techniques covered over the course of the class. That's what we talked about with regard to the program note. Include the extended program note. And then the last 2 just have to do with showing me that you know what you're doing and that you've thought about your work. So demonstrate a knowledge of sound synthesis and demonstrate creativity, effort, and a high standard of performance. And performance there we're using really broadly. You may be actually performing your piece on a keyboard or something, or you're recording it that way at least. Or you might be just, patching and programming sequencers and arranging things from SoundGrain. We can think of that in a more broad sense as a kind of performance in this sense. So submission, this is what I'm going to look for from you on Blackboard. Students should upload the following to the Blackboard File Exchange by the end of the day on Thursday, May 14th. The first one is an audio recording of the full project. That is a WAV or an MP3, just a recording of your final piece. The second thing is your main VCV Rack project file, and I say where relevant, because if you're doing a SoundGrain project, you're not going to need to submit a VCV Rack file. But if you're doing the first option or the third option, there'll be a VCV Rack file that you're working with. If it's the first option, then there's just one VCV Rack file. Your whole piece lives in one file, so that's all I would need. If you're doing the second one, maybe you make a sequence in one file, maybe you make a drum beat in a different file. Maybe they're together in the same file, I don't know, but just submit the main one, or if you feel like they're both kind of equal value, maybe you submit both of them. And of course in VCV Rec, I'd still want you to be using the color coding system that we've been using for the patch chords to keep everything clean and also make it clear to me that you guys know how you're routing things. The third thing is a DAW session. Again, where relevant. If you're doing the first project, you don't need a DAW session, but if you're doing the second 2, you would. So a DAW session where relevant with all assets included. So we're going to talk about what that means here in just a second. With regard to specific DAWs, if you're working in Audacity, Osin Audio, Reaper, Logic, or GarageBand, that's all perfect. If you're working in anything else, go ahead and let me know ahead of time and check with me. I may be able to open it on my computer, I may not, and if not, I might ask you to submit screenshots or something like that. So Audacity, Osin Audio, Reaper, Logic, GarageBand, all those for sure we're good. Anything else, check with me first. And then the last thing would be your program note, which you can submit as a Word doc or a PDF, and you can just upload that to the file exchange with everything else. And of course, I say again at the bottom, I need these in by May 14th. That's the last possible day, and no late assignments will be accepted, and I can't give any extensions, because honestly, this is as late as I can push things already. So one last thing here, let's go over what I said a second ago when I say I want you to submit a DAW session with all assets included. GarageBand is a really straightforward DAW. It's meant to be very easy to work with. And so what GarageBand does, whenever you're working with it, whenever you're dragging in sound files that come from different sources, GarageBand will automatically save all those as part of your project. They'll make a copy of those sound files and save them with your GarageBand file. Almost every other DAW doesn't necessarily do that. They might just contain a note in the session that says, hey, this sound file is located on the computer's desktop. Look for it there. Or this sound file is located in the documents folder, in the folder called granulated sound files. Look for it there. And so to save space, they don't actually copy the sound files into the project folder or the project session. And so if you were to send this to somebody and like me to grade, or to a potential collaborator to work with, they might open up the DAW session and everything's missing. All the audio files are not actually there. And so in order to avoid this, you have to tell the DAW to include all the assets, that is all the different sound recordings and things like that, in the file itself. So let's talk about how to do that. The two examples I gave you guys are Reaper and Audacity. You can obviously use different DAWs, but those are the two I'll walk through with you here. So I'm going to take two granulated sound files that I've created in SoundGrain, and I'm going to open them in Audacity. So I've got one of an organ. It's been kind of time stretched out, and another one of some rocks. So I'm going to copy this rocks one and close it. I'm going to generate a new track. Not generate. I'm going to go up to tracks and add a new stereo track. And then I'm going to go wherever I want this to be pasted. And I'm going to Command V and paste the rocks there. And now I'll hear the organ. And then the rocks come in. And maybe I want to fade that in. I'm going to go up here to my automation and kind of fade those rocks in. Now it's a little hard to slide things around in Audacity, but if I wanted this to move a little bit backwards, I could just highlight some of the empty space here and delete it. And it will move back. If I wanted it to move forwards, I'd actually just have to generate more silence. So let's say I want to generate 10 seconds of silence. That'll push it forward 10 seconds. So that can be a little tedious when you're working in Audacity, but that's how it's done. Okay, so let's say that this project was good and it was finished. So then I want to, I can export the actual sound file. So I would just go to File, Export, and do that. I'm not going to do that right now. But the thing I want to show you guys about saving the assets is I want to save an Audacity file. So I'm going to go to Save Project, and I'll just call this Granular, and I'm going to save it to my desktop. And so a screen comes up that says the project depends on other audio files. And that's what we were talking about a second ago. It's saying that it needs these other audio files to be a complete project. So it says copying these files into your project will remove this dependency. And this is safer, but it needs more disk space. And if you're working by yourself on a project that's not for this class or not for a collaborator that you're working with or something, maybe that's fine. Maybe you want to conserve that disk space. But at least for this project, you're going to copy these. So you're going to say copy all files. And now on my desktop, I have an Audacity file, and I have a file and a folder that says granular data. And in here, it's got all the stuff. So I could delete my two originals, and still when I open my granular project in Audacity, my sound files are there. And if I didn't copy them into the project, it would be saying, hey, we can't find the files. What's going on here? So then when you would submit that, you would want to zip these into the same folder. On a Mac, you would just right-click, go to Compress, and then you'll end up with a zip folder with both of those files together, and that's what you would upload to Blackboard. And it's just called Archive for now, but I could rename it Granular or last name Final or whatever. And then this is what I would upload to Blackboard along with my recording. All right, so let's do the same thing in Reaper. So here I am in Reaper. I know this is a piece of software that we've not talked about at all this semester and we haven't worked in together. I just mentioned it because it's a really powerful DAW that's free for non-commercial use, and they've got an extended student license with regard to the pandemic and everything. So I'm going to take my two granulated sound files, drag them into Reaper, put them on separate tracks, and then I could slide them around. I could automate the volume to fade things in. And it's a little bit easier to slide things around in Reaper than it was in Audacity, which potentially is maybe more useful for you. All right, so let's say this project is good, it's solid, I want to save it and be done with it. I can go up to render my sound file. I won't do that now. And then I can go to Save Project to save my session. I'll call it granular. And then down here are the options I was mentioning. So you want to create a subdirectory for the project. I would recommend doing that. That's going to create a little folder that's going to save everything together for your project in the same folder. Otherwise, it's just going to be all out on your desktop or wherever. And then this is the important one here, copy all media into the project directory. And then you can actually convert things into the same format if you want to do that. I don't usually mess with that. But if you copy all your media into the project directory, that's a good thing. And then we hit save. And then on my desktop, I've got a folder called granular. And when I open it up, inside I've got my Reaper project, but then I've also got my original sound files and the format that Reaper has changed them into. So I've got everything I need in the same project, in the same folder. And then I can compress that also. And then I would end up with a zip folder that I could upload to Blackboard. All right, so I believe that's everything you guys need to do the final project. Again, I'll be posting a separate lesson on generative and performative techniques in VCV-RAC, just as a last thing that might be useful for you guys. Otherwise, I'll look forward to hearing from you as you work on your projects as needed, and then I'll look forward to seeing your projects at the end of next week. So yeah, thanks a lot.